Good morning, it's Corinne from the Sewing Works, and today I'm going to show you how to make our quilted daisy in a frame block with your rulers. So that's what it looks like finished. And first we're going to start out with marking. So the handy tool for marking this block is your 8-point crosshair square. I have a 12.5-inch square here, and 8.5 would work since we're only using 8.5-inch blocks. I do already have my 8.5-inch border marked on my block, and I'm going to show you how to mark it if you have this nifty tool and also if you don't have this tool. So let's get started. Alright, so first, if you have a crosshair square, 8-point crosshair square, you're going to use it to line up on your corners and into your center, just kind of wiggling it to get everything where you want it to be, and then you're going to go ahead and mark those 8 lines. I'm going to mark the center too as well. The super nice thing about this crosshair square is if this was a piece block and it wasn't perfectly square, I could fudge my ruler left and right to get it as straight as possible within the square. Unfortunately, the other marking method, you have to reference the corners, and if these corners are way off compared to these corners, your center could be off as well. So this is a great tool, especially for ruler work, and it makes marking super fast. So there I have 8 different lines. This first set of 8 lines, I'm going to mark my spokes at both. Well, first I'll start with 3 1/4 inches from center. So I put my ruler on the dot in the middle and go out to 3 1/4 inches, and I just make a little hash mark there and go around and mark all of those. Okay, now I'm also going to mark these same 8 spokes a 1/2 inch in from the outer edge of the block. Okay, so now I have my 8 spokes, each with 2 lines on them, and I want to add another 8 spokes. So you'll see there are white reference lines. You can kind of see that on my arm, the white reference lines, to line up another angle away. So you'll put those white reference lines on the lines I have already drawn, making sure my center is lined up again. And this might just take a 1/2 second to get it where I want. That looks pretty good. So I'll go ahead and mark my other 8 spokes. Now I have 16 spokes, and the last 8 spokes, I'm only going to mark that 3 1/4 inches. I'm not going to do the second set of marking. And now this is ready to quilt. So if you don't have a crosshair square, I'm going to show you what you're going to do. So this is an 8.5-inch block. So I know that halfway across each side is 4 1/4 inches. So I'm going to use my ruler to mark that 4 1/4 inches on all sides. Then I'm going to line it up on my marks to mark a vertical and a horizontal center line. Similarly, I will use the corner marks to do my diagonals. Now I'm going to use my ruler to make my 3 1/4 inch hash marks all the way around. And also that 1/2 inch from the edge, I'm going to mark on these spokes. Okay, so that part wasn't too bad. This is where it gets a little tricky without the crosshair square. So I need to make an additional 8 spokes in between these lines, evenly spaced. So what I'm going to do is measure between my 2 hash marks, which is about 2.5 inches from spoke to spoke. And so the center of that would be 1 1/4 inches. And I'm going to mark that 1 1/4 inches with a dot. So now you see I have a dot between each of my spokes that measures the middle. So I will use my ruler. Maybe we can zoom in just a little bit, you can see better. Use my ruler to line up the dots on opposite sides to create another spoke. 2 spokes actually. And now I'll finish off by marking those last spokes at 3 1/4 inches out. This will not be where your dot was, so you might want to emphasize your hash larger than the dot that you made to create the line, so you know which one to use. So I went ahead and emphasized all of my major hash marks, since those will be the tips of my petals as I come around, and it'll be easier for me to see that. These markings on the outside are going to be used for our framework at the end. And we're ready to get started quilting. Alright, so we are ready to quilt our framed daisy block. We're going to be using the 12-inch arc ruler side of our Sew Steady ruler and our handy spacing gauge. First thing you'll want to do is get tied in the center of your block, and then we're going to start coming out to each one of our spoke lines. So these marks that I've created at 3 1/4 inches out is where I want my needle to land. Because my foot creates a 1/4 inch gap, I can use my 1/4 inch leg of my spacing gauge against my arc to line up exactly where to hold my ruler so that my needle will hit the mark. And I will just sew out. Until I hit that mark. Then I'm going to do the other side of my petal. I'll line up against my foot as I did the first time. And I'll spin this so you guys can see what I'm doing. I'm going back to the center, using my 1/4 inch spacing gauge to get lined up where I should be. And back in we go. And stop when we get there. Now, in order to decrease the amount of bulk that accumulates in the center here, when I travel out this way and come back in, I'm going to want to continue to travel out on the opposite side. That way I'm not getting a bunch of in and then back out, in and then back out. So we'll line it up to come over to this right spoke. Once again, using our 1/4 inch spacing gauge. Actually, I guess that's our left spoke. Must be too early. And we'll sew on out to there. And when we hit the line, we'll turn around to the line back up with the middle. Remember each time that we're pushing against the foot before we line up the other edge. And back in. So I am going to skip every other petal to kind of get the basis laid down and then come back and fill in. Okay, as you can see, I've come all the way around making all of my petals. Maybe not quite all of my points are perfectly on my hash marks. I'm not worried about that. Virtually no flowers are perfect. And once these marks are gone, the naked eye won't be able to see that difference. I'm also not concerned about any of this overlapping of the petals. It just helps give it some definition of the layering of all the petals in the center. It's not drastic enough for me to worry about. If it did bother me when I was coming back in, I could have hit the line of the last petal and traveled in on it to give it a cleaner center. So now I'm going to go ahead and tie off, which will be a needle up, grab my thread, foot down, needle down and back up, and then we'll work my bobbin thread to the top. And now we're ready to get started on the frame. Okay, to start the frame, I'm going to start on the tip of one of my petals that does not also have a hash mark near the outer edge of my block on that same spoke. And I'm going to use my spacing gauge and my foot to get my ruler lined up so that I can sew out to that hash mark. And stopping when I get there. Now I'm going to come back into my next petal tip. So just kind of bouncing in and out. I'll work my way around for my first set of framework. So as I'm finishing up this first framework, I am keeping in mind that when I line my ruler up, I want to make sure that my handy grip or whatever kind of gripping adhesive I'm using on my ruler is on my quilt. It's not going to do me any good if it's out here. It's going to slip. The other tip I'm not sure if I've mentioned to you before, but if you've been around me, you've probably heard it. We want to make sure that we're using the flat side of our spacing gauge against the flat side of our ruler. If you twist it a little bit like this, you can get off on your measurement. So flat to flat, we always say when you're lining up. Once again, my grip is way out here, so I'm going to adjust my ruler in, keeping that flat to flat. And it just makes it so much easier to travel out to my points. And I'm going to travel back into where I started, keeping in mind those two things again. And now I've created my complete first border. I'm going to travel in 1/4 inch on my petal now, and I'll know I'm there when the edge of my foot shows the stitching line on the outside there. Now I'm just going to create a 1/4 inch echo by lining my stitching line up on my ruler, again being mindful of where my handy grip is, and stitching out until I hit that spoke line. And lining up again on the stitch line, coming back into the next petal. And when I hit the edge of the petal, I'm going to stop and travel out around the tip and back down in. When I'm a 1/4 inch in, I'll line back up and continue this process all the way around. Okay, here's my final completion of my second echo border. And when I'm done, I'm just going to travel out to that tip so it looks nice and even on both sides. And then needle up, pull my tail to the top. Okay, so we finished our flower in a frame block, and this is what it looks like with all those lines pressed off, nice and crisp and clean. There is a little bit of buildup in the center. Like I said, if you travel across when you're making your petals, you can eliminate some of that. And here's what it looks like on the back. All I have to do now is trim my borders down and put some binding on it or put it in a quilt. Thanks for joining us.